Assalamu alaikum ji. I'm your instructor for History and Systems of Psychology, and the last time we had covered the initial reaction of man towards mental illness, that is in the 27th lecture. We will talk about the history of mental illness up to the present time in this lecture, that is number 28. Before we start today's lecture, let us review what we had done in lecture number 27. आपको याद होगा मैं अपने लेक्चर्स के दौरान आपको नसीहत और कुछ रास्ते बताता रहता हूँ. नसीहत एक आज की ये है कि हर रोज़ कम अज़ कम एक काम ऐसा ज़रूर कीजिए जिसको आप नेक काम या नेकी समझते हैं, कम अज़ कम. और एक मेरे ख़्याल में नेकी ये भी है कि दूसरों के लिए ज़िंदगी आसान करना, दूसरों के लिए मुश्किलात को कम करना भी एक नेकी है. और भी अल्लाह ताला ने और रसूल पाक सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम ने हज़ारों नेकियों का ज़िक्र किया है. आप भी उन नेकियों में हिस्सा लीजिए, एक नेकी दिन में ज़रूर कीजिए. वैसे तो मोमिन इसी चीज़ में हमेशा मसरूफ़ रहता है कि वो नेक रास्ता ही इख्तियार करे, लेकिन कॉन्शियसली भी आप ऐसी चीज़ को अडॉप्ट करें जो आप समझते हैं कि वो एक नेकी है. अब इससे आगे चलें. हमने आपको ये भी बताया था कि आपको यादाश्त या हाफ़ज़ा बेहतर करने के लिए क्या करना चाहिए. रिविज़न इज़ एन इम्पॉर्टेंट एलिमेंट. बार बार दोहराना आपके हाफ़ज़े और आपकी यादाश्त के लिए बहुत अच्छा तरीक़ाकार है. इसलिए इसको ज़रूर अपने ऊपर आज़माते रहिए और इसकी मश्क करते रहिए. मैंने ये भी बताया था आपको कि जो कुछ आप सीखें पढ़ें, सिर्फ इस कोर्स में नहीं बाकी और कोर्सेज़ में भी उसको रोज़मर्रा की ज़िंदगी पे ज़रूर अप्लाई करें. रिवाइजिंग एंड एप्लीकेशन are two important tools of improving your memory, particularly from the point of view of examinations. चलिए अब आगे चलते हैं इस नसीहत और एडवाइस के बाद और देखते हैं कि पिछली दफ़े हमने लेक्चर नंबर 27 में क्या क्या देखा था. लेक्चर नंबर 27 concerned about the history of mental diseases, how man regarded mental diseases in earlier stages and how then he later gradually over time periods, over centuries changed his view. And we had brought you up to about the 17th, the 18th, the 16th century. चलिए उसका रिव्यू कर लेते हैं. Ancient man, if you remember, considered mental disease, याद कीजिए, as a result of the influence of the soul, the psyche, the evil spirits or demons, जिन्नात और भूत और even Satan, शैतान. पुराने ज़माने में लोगों का यही ख्याल था कि मेंटल डिजीज़ जो है, पागलपन जो है, जो एक शख्स मखबूतुल हवास है, इंशिकाक ज़हनी का मरीज़ है, ये सारी टर्म्स मॉडर्न टर्म्स हैं, लेकिन उस वक्त a mentally sick person was regarded as being possessed by, taken over by spirits, demons or even the devil. पुराने लोगों का ये ख्याल था that there is a soul within a person, and when that person sleeps, that soul escapes from his body and then performs things that he sees in his dreams. And if the dreams are nightmares, then of course the man became frightened. So what he would do was to attach fish hooks and thorns, कांटे और मछली के कांटे से वो अपने नाक और सुराख हैं उनको बंद कर लिया करता था, ताकि the soul should not be able to escape and should not perform evil or bad things. So soul had an identity of its own, could do things on its own. That is how the ancient man regarded the soul, and that is what he thought soul was doing to him, including resulting in appearance of certain psychological or mental symptoms. So soul was regarded to be the main source of mental illness in the ancient man. We also saw how the ancient Greeks and the Romans regarded mental disease. Initially, they thought that it was a possession of the body by spirits, and that certain regimens, varzishein, exercises could rid the body of that possession. Later on, the ancient Greeks and the Romans developed certain herbal medicines. वो अद्वियात जो नेचर में मौजूद हैं, जो जड़ी बूटियों से हासिल की जाती हैं, उनके ज़रिए से एंशंट ग्रीक्स और रोमन्स ने ज़हनी बीमारियों का इलाज शुरू किया, और वो इस परस्यूट में, इस कोशिश में काफ़ी हद तक कामयाब भी रहे. कुछ लोगों का उस वक्त ये भी ख्याल था कि those people who are possessed by such spirits could also foretell the future. कुछ लोगों का अब तक ये ख्याल है, और ये पाकिस्तान में भी ऐसा ही है, कुछ लोगों का अब तक ये ख्याल है, ख़ास तौर पे हमारे वो लोग जो तालीम से अभी तक तालीम की रोशनी से हमकिनार नहीं हुए, उनका भी कुछ लोगों का ये ख्याल है कि मेंटल डिजीज़ जो है, ज़हनी अमराज जो हैं, वो स्पिरिट्स की पोजेशन की वजह से ऐसे है जैसे इंसान पे कोई जिन या भूत काबिज हो जाए. उनका अब तक ये ख्याल है, और वो अब तक जड़ी बूटों के ज़रिए या कुछ और वर्जिशों के ज़रिए उस ईवल स्पिरिट से बेचारे बीमार लोगों का इलाज करना चाहते हैं. ये पुराना ख्याल है, और इससे इंसान बहुत आगे निकल चुका है. यही ख्याल रोमन्स और ग्रीक्स का था. आपको ये भी याद होगा कि पिछली दफ़े हमने ये भी जिक्र किया था कि उसके बाद यूरोप में जब रिलीजियस ऑर्थोडॉक्सी began to control the state and the state institutions, it was then that mental disease was regarded as a manifestation of evil and the devil, and people who suffered from these diseases were treated with cruelty, were chained, were handcuffed, were put into small cages, were tortured, were physically hurt, were beaten, and also were burnt alive to death. ये याद है आपको? ये भी होता रहा है in relation to mental diseases. And then we touched upon how the French and the Industrial Revolution led to an opening of man's point of view, and he started to regard mentally sick people as people suffering from diseases and not possessed by evil spirits, and not necessarily witches. जादूगर या जादूगरनियां, अब उनको कहना उन्होंने बंद कर दिया, उनको जलाना बंद कर दिया. And this was after the French and the Industrial Revolution, and by that time mental diseases were regarded as a kind of illness, a kind of a nervous disease. And we had covered that in the last lecture. Let us go forward now and let us pursue man's reaction to mental diseases and take a further look at some of the milestones in the history of recognition of mental diseases as mental diseases. तकरीबन 1790 के दौरान ये देखा गया कि कुछ लोग जो हैं वो एक बीमारी में मुब्तला हो जाते जिसका लोगों को, उस वक्त के डॉक्टरों को पता नहीं चल रहा था कि क्या ये जिस्मानी बीमारी है या कोई और बीमारी है. इसलिए उस असर के तहत, उस वबा के तहत फ्रेंच डॉक्टर्स जो थे, ये किस्सा फ्रांस में पेश आया 1790 में, तो फ्रांसीसी डॉक्टरों ने, the French physicians started separating these people from other physical diseases. It was then discovered that these diseases were actually nervous diseases, that they were diseases that we now call mental diseases. And that is how, after 1790, nervous diseases were formally separated from other diseases, and that is how sufferers from these nervous diseases were separated from common thieves, robbers, and criminals. So we can regard these years, 1790 onwards, as the beginning of the scientific outlook at mental disorders. That's the beginning. Okay? Let's go forward. What happened then? In France, now a very famous name, Philippe Pinel, a physician in France who was born in 1745, in view of what had taken place a couple of years ago, when it was decided that people were suffering from nervous diseases as separated from criminality, or what previously had been called possession of the body by evil spirits. When man saw this, when scientists saw this, when scientists could distinguish nervous diseases from the old view of possession of body by evil spirits, that was the beginning of how people who were suffering from physical diseases, from mental diseases, got some relief. And Pinel is a person who is considered to have provided that relief. Because the old view was that they were possessed by spirits, mentally mad people or mentally sick people were put in chains, were put in small cages, were tortured. Pinel is the first person who in 1792 took the bold step of releasing all patients suffering from these nervous diseases or mental symptoms from their chains. They were now freed. They were taken out of their small cages. Their handcuffs were taken off. The chains that they were wearing around their neck, their bodies and their feet were taken off, and they were considered as people suffering from diseases and not people who were possessed by evil spirits or the devil himself. So pioneer is in this regard a French physician by the name of Pinel. The same kind of steps were taken in another industrialized country, and that is England, where Samuel Tuke, as you can see on your screen, was the pioneer in England who unchained people suffering from nervous diseases, or what today we call people suffering from mental diseases. What Pinel did in France, Samuel Tuke did in England. They are both pioneers. अब आप मुझे बताना पसंद करेंगे कि क्या वजह है कि ये फ्रांस और इंग्लैंड में nervous disease की recognition as mental disease or separated from criminality and separated from physical disease took place. One reason that some psychologists believe was that these two countries had undergone the process of the French and the Industrial Revolution, bringing forth a new spirit of inquiry, a new way of looking at things, a creative way of looking at things, a different, progressive, forward-looking way of looking at things. And that is why some psychologists believe these were the two countries that took the lead, that became pioneers in unchaining people suffering from mental diseases. Mental diseases now were no longer considered the possession by demons, no longer considered the possession by evil spirits, and they were no longer considered to be in the realm of magic. They were brought under the scrutiny of scientific outlook. So, by the 19th century, a very scientific outlook, a progressive outlook had developed towards evaluating, looking at mental diseases. And we need to go and take a look at some other factors related to mental diseases before I describe to you the recent or the modern outlook towards mental diseases. एक दो लोगों का जिक्र मैं समझता हूँ इसमें करना जो है वो ज़रूरी है. And one of them is a man by the name of Franz Mesmer. Franz Mesmer was born in 1734 and he died in 1815. आपने शायद सुना होगा, he was considered in the early 19th century, 1808, 10, 6 is the beginning of which century? 18th or 19th? Well, you are right. That's the beginning of 19th century. 1800 साल पूरे हो चुके हैं और 19वीं सदी शुरू हो रही है. Mesmer treated many mentally sick patients by a method which is today called mesmerism. आपने शायद पुरानी किताबों में उसका किस्सा भी पढ़ा होगा और शायद आपको मालूम भी होगा कि mesmerism was considered a kind of a magical method of treatment of mental disorders. Well, actually, let us take a scientific look at who was Franz Mesmer and what was his method of treatment of mental disorders and whether it had some merit or not. As I said first, Mesmer was a kind of a physician, a healer. He put forward the view that some men, some people have a kind of a force, a kind of an energy which he called animal magnetism. Hayvani maqnatisiyat, animal magnetism, was considered by Mesmer, Franz Mesmer, who developed the method of mesmerism as a treatment of mental disorders. He regarded animal magnetism as a vehicle of treatment of mental disorders. He thought that all people have animal magnetism. In some people, the balance in animal magnetism gets disturbed, gets upset, and as a result of that imbalance, they become mad or they suffer from mental disorders. And then he thought that some people who were high in animal magnetism and whose animal magnetism was balanced, they could intervene in those people, intervene in the animal magnetism of those people whose balance had been disturbed, and then through this animal magnetism of theirs, they could restore the balance of other people and thus cure other people. Interesting, isn't it? दिलचस्प कहानी है. Franz Mesmer treated many people by touching them. He thought his energy of animal magnetism passed from his body to the body of a person who was mentally sick, and by touching that mentally sick person, he could treat him. And he taught that other people could also do the same thing. That they could treat mentally sick people by touching them or by passing their animal magnetism into the other person's body and thereby treat the other person who suffers from mental disease or mental symptoms. तो एक तो उसका ये तरीका था ट्रीटमेंट का. एक और तरीका ये था कि इस वजह से जब उसका इलाज जो था वो काफी कामयाब रहा, काफी मरीज जो थे वो ठीक हो गए, उसका भी हम आपको साइंटिफिक बेसिस बताएंगे कि कैसे हुआ ऐसा ही. ये जादू वाली बात नहीं है, बताते हैं आपको वो भी. जस्ट स्टे विद अस. इस तरीका इलाज से उसने बहुत से लोगों को ठीक किया जब लोग ठीक होने शुरू हुए तो उसके पास ज़ाहिर है लोगों का जमघटा आना शुरू हो गया, मरीज सारे मुल्क से उसके पास आने शुरू हो गए, एंड ही डिडंट हैव एनफ टाइम टू टच एवरीबॉडी एंड pass on his animal magnetism, his energy in the body of the other person, the sufferer, and treat him. So what did he do? Initially, he would put his hand in a bathtub full of water and then ask people to either dip themselves in there or put their hand or feet into the same bathtub, such that he taught his animal magnetism by touching his hand putting his hand into the water, passed into the water and from water into the bodies of the people who are suffering, and thereby animal magnetism shifted. अब ये टब को इस्तेमाल करने की, पानी से भरे हुए टब की क्या जरूरत थी? इसमें बहुत से लोग बायक वक्त हाथ या पांव डाल के उसके ख्याल में इलाज से इस्तिफादा हासिल कर सकते थे, इसलिए उसने ये तरीका अख्तियार किया. उसने एक और तरीका भी ये अख्तियार किया, दैट ही वुड टच ए ट्री एंड देन आस्क पीपल टू टच द ब्रांचेस एंड लीव्स ऑफ दैट ट्री, एंड ही थॉट ही कुड पास हिज एनिमल मैग्नेटिज्म फ्रॉम हिज ओन बॉडी into the tree, into the branches, into the leaves, and from there the branches and the leaves, animal magnetism would pass into the bodies of people who were suffering from mental diseases, and thus mental diseases could be cured. बहुत से मरीजों ने उसके इस तरीका इलाज से फ़ायदा उठाया, लेकिन बहुत से लोग ऐसे भी थे जिनको इस तरीका इलाज का फ़ायदा नहीं हुआ. हुकूमत वक्त ने कोशिश की कि इस तरीका इलाज को किसी तरह से स्टैंडर्डाइज किया जा सके और किसी तरीके से ये देखा जा सके कि क्या इसमें कुछ सच्चाई का एलिमेंट भी है या नहीं. आफ्टर मैनी एक्सपेरिमेंटेशंस एंड ऑब्जर्वेशंस, इट वाज डिस्कवर्ड that there was no such thing as animal magnetism, that animal magnetism did not pass from the body of Franz Mesmer into the people suffering from mental diseases and thus cured them, that it was something else. We will talk about that something else presently, but it was something else. So Franz Mesmer fell into bad repute and he died. Now notice one thing. In fact, notice two things. Number one, that now mental diseases have been separated from the possession of evil spirits and criminals, and mental diseases are considered to have been treatable, although the method of treatment adopted by Franz Mesmer was doubtful. But they were considered to be treatable. अब इससे थोड़ा सा आगे चलते हैं, एंड वी विल टॉक अबाउट अनदर लैंडमार्क इन द हिस्ट्री ऑफ मेंटल डिजीजेस. दैट लैंडमार्क इज द बिगिनिंग ऑफ hypnotism. A British surgeon by the name of James Bride, as you can read on your screens, who was born in 1795 and who died in 1860, was impressed by Mesmer's method, although he did not contribute to Mesmer's point of view that it was animal magnetism that treated people. He put forward the view that mental diseases can be cured by a certain way in which the mentally sick person could be brought to accept the suggestions, ideas given to him by the physician, that there was no force such as animal magnetism, Bride said, the British surgeon, but that mental diseases could be cured by getting the patient to accept whatever the physician wants him to learn and accept. And this basic principle he used in the method of hypnotism. आप अपनी स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे होंगे. Getting mentally sick people into a state of mind which was open to the suggestion of the physician was called a state of hypnotism. Conversely, hypnotism was created by the physicians in the mentally sick person as a state of mind where the patient is ready to accept the suggestions given by the physician. उनका तरीकाकार भी आप जानते हैं क्या था, आपने पढ़ा होगा. Hypnotists usually suggest to a patient or the subjects that they are feeling drowsy, that their eyelids are getting heavier, that they are feeling more and more sleepy, that they are relaxed and that they are going to sleep. Some hypnotists also show the subject a shiny object in front of their eyes so that, and ask the subject to look at that shiny object so that their eyes can become a little bit tired and fixated on that shiny object, and they begin to agree with the suggestions given to them. If this procedure Bride showed and experienced that if this procedure of suggesting that the person is going to sleep, and if it is repeated over a given time period of, let us say, 10, 15, 10, 12 minutes, then some people actually go into a sleep, a suggested sleep, which actually is not a sleep but a hypnotic trance. Now that patient is ready to listen to whatever the physician suggests. Bride treated many patients, particularly patients of hysteria, using hypnotic trance. You see that there is the basic idea that Mesmer had said, that there is something in the physician that passes on to the patient, and that something Mesmer had called animal magnetism. The Bride isn't saying that it was animal magnetism. Bride is saying that by giving suggestions to the patient comes into a trance, a state of trance or a state of suggestibility. And then whatever the physician suggests to the patient agrees to that, and gradually, when this process is repeated again and again over a span of weeks, days and months, the patient begins to come out of his mental disorder. And that was Bride's method of treatment, and that was the treatment that we now call hypnotism. By the way, hypnotism is still used, but under some different names, although some hypnotists or hypnotherapists still practice, but the basic tenet that hypnotic stage or hypnotic trance is a heightened state of suggestibility, is still used. We know that in industry, in sports, in small group dynamics, in organizational behavior techniques, many psychologists, managers, sports coaches use this technique of bringing people, players, employees into a heightened state of suggestibility, and thus helps them perform at their peak. ये अब भी इस्तेमाल होता है, although not in the old sense that Bride had used it. So hypnotism was another method of treatment of mental disorders. We need to talk about two more physicians, doctors, psychologists in regard to the history of mental illness. One was a French physician, as you can see on your screen, by the name of Jean Charcot. Please notice the pronunciation. It's written as Jean Charcot, but that is not how you pronounce it in French. In French, it is pronounced as Jean, 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 and Charcot, Charco. The T at the end is silent. Jean Charcot was born in 1825 and he died in 1893. Jean Charcot had used hypnotism in France as a method of treatment, and based upon his researches, he wrote a very famous article in one of the very famous research journals in France, where he reported the findings and his observations related to his use of method of hypnotism. इसलिए ये मैं इसका जिक्र करना ज़रूरी समझता हूँ कि इसके बाद जो हम पढ़ेंगे, ख़ास तौर पे साइको एनालिसिस या फ्रॉइड का जिक्र, उसमें जहाँ शार्को का बहुत अहम कंट्रीब्यूशन है. Charcot had shown that hysteria particularly can be treated using hypnotism. Now where are we? We are so much further away from ancient views about mental illness. Now we are not thinking, by we I mean psychologists, we are not thinking of mentally sick people as possessed by demon or evil spirits. We are not thinking that they are the same as criminals. We are not thinking that by bleeding them or chaining them or even burning them at stake, considering them to be witches and wizards, we can treat mental disorder by using certain methodologies. One methodology that is being currently discussed is hypnotism. Although mesmerism had fallen into bad repute, but the basic idea that Mesmer had given, that there is something in there that helps treatment between the patient and the doctor, and there was discovered to be suggestibility or the hypnotic trance that helps the physician to treat the mentally sick person. And Charcot showed by his experimentation that hysteria can be treated. The other person in this regard that you need to know about is Brenheim. As you can see on your screen, Brenheim, born 1840, died 1919. He showed, based upon his own observation, and his own medical practice that it is not only hysteria that can be treated by hypnotic trance, that other mental diseases could also be treated by using hypnosis. एक इंटरेस्टिंग बात यह है इन दोनों फिजिशियंस के बारे में कि इन्होंने हिस्टीरिया का ट्रीटमेंट हिप्नोटिज्म में ढूंढ लिया. एक इंटरेस्टिंग बात. दूसरी इंटरेस्टिंग बात यह है कि इन दोनों ने यह भी देखा कि ये क्योर जो है, क्योरिंग ऑफ हिस्टीरिया बाय हिप्नोटिज्म is not a permanent cure. Unfortunately, it continues up to a time, and then the patients tend to develop similar or other symptoms. और जैसे मैंने अभी बात कही कि ब्रेनहाइम ने यह भी देखा था कि सिर्फ हिस्टीरिया ही नहीं बल्कि इससे और दूसरे ज़हनी अमराज जो हैं हिप्नोटिज्म के ज़रिए, उन ज़हनी अमराज का इलाज भी पॉसिबल है. ये दो चार बातें अब मद्देनज़र रखिए. वी आर इन द अर्ली 20th century and the current usage of hypnotism is considered the main treatment of mental disorders. So, by the 20th century, mental disorders were clearly separated from physical disorders. इनकी क्लियर डिमार्केशन फिजिकल डिजीज से तो हो गई, लेकिन मेंटल डिजीजेस के अपने पैरामीटर्स क्लियरली डिफाइन नहीं हुए थे. और ये काम माहिरीन नफ्सियात ने आईसीडी और डीएसएम के जरिए किया. इस पे भी थोड़ी सी बात हो जानी चाहिए. आईसीडी stands for International Classification of Diseases. International Classification of Diseases is a work undertaken under the aegis of World Health Organization, or WHO for short. WHO जो कि यूनाइटेड नेशंस का आप जानते हैं एक ज़ैली इदारा है. WHO ने, वर्ल्ड हेल्थ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने दुनिया के तमाम बर्रे आज़मों के लोगों से तजावीज़ मांगी और उनके एक्सपर्ट्स को इकट्ठा किया, और उन एक्सपर्ट्स ने मिलके बहुत सोच विचार के बाद ये तय किया कि मेंटल डिजीज है क्या, उसकी कितनी अक़साम हैं, और फिर इस सारी डिलिब्रेशन को एक किताबचे की शक्ल में वर्ल्ड हेल्थ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने पब्लिश कर दिया. उसको इंटरनेशनल क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ डिजीजेस या ICD-9 कहा जाता है, ICD कहा जाता है. इसकी बहुत सी रिविजन्स हैं, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 रिविजन्स इसकी कुछ कुछ अरसे के बाद तमाम 20वीं सदी में होती रही हैं. और ये दुनिया में मां सिवाय नॉर्थ अमेरिकन कॉन्टिनेंट के, दुनिया में ये एक ज़हनी अमराज की तारीफ की, उसकी मैनिफेस्टेशंस की, उसकी सिम्टम्स की एक मुस्तनद मुकम्मल लिस्ट है. तो अगर किसी शख्स को भी ये देखना हो कि कोई शख्स किसी मेंटल डिजीज में मुब्तला है या नहीं, तो वो ICD के मुताबिक उसको जज कर सकता है. 20वीं सदी में एक एफर्ट ये हुई है जिसे हम आईसीडी या इंटरनेशनल क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ डिजीजेस कहते हैं. इसके साथ साथ पैरेलल एक मूवमेंट चलती रही नॉर्थ अमेरिकन कॉन्टिनेंट में. जैसे मैंने आपसे अभी गुजारिश की थी कि दुनिया भर के माहिरीन मां सिवाय नॉर्थ अमेरिकन कॉन्टिनेंट के इसमें आईसीडी में शामिल थे. अमेरिकन स्पेशलिस्ट्स जो थे, those people under the guidance of APA, American Psychiatric Association, do not confuse APA with other branches. APA stands for American Psychiatric Association. The American Psychiatric Association invited suggestions and experts to define boundaries and manifestations and parameters of mental diseases. They held many meetings, and as a result of those deliberations, they separately prepared a list of their own, which they called DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was the American version of what are mental diseases, what are the various manifestations of mental diseases. There are many revisions of DSM also, 1 and 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 and R. Later, the experts from the North American continent and the experts from all over the world pooled their information together and came up with a comprehensive list of ICD and DSM. इस वक्त मौजूदा, जबकि मैं आपसे बात कर रहा हूं, इस वक्त मौजूदा दौर में there is an agreed comprehensive list of what are mental diseases, what are their symptoms, and these are available on the internet. These are available on the book, in the book form, wherever anybody wants to take a look at them. They are also available in your textbooks of abnormal psychology. तो ये दो अहम क्लासिफिकेशंस जो हैं, ये 20वीं सदी में पहली मर्तबे दुनिया के बड़े बड़े ममालिक के एक्सपर्ट्स ने मिलकर एक ओवरऑल comprehensive classification of mental diseases दी है, which now defines what are mental diseases and how are they separated from other diseases. Before we end today, let us see what we had talked about in regard to the development of man's knowledge about mental diseases. The ancients, as you remember, considered mental diseases as the work of soul, or the work of evil spirits, or the work of the demons or the devil. The ancient Greeks and the Romans also considered a part that soul plays in the creation of mental diseases, but they also thought that certain imbalances in the body result in mental diseases. Later, mental diseases was regarded as possession of the body by evil spirits, so people were chained, tortured, and even burned to death. As a result of the French and the Industrial Revolution, a new outlook developed, and then man's outlook towards mental diseases also changed. He adopted more scientific look at mental diseases. Until in the 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, they were completely separated from other diseases. And then in the later 20th century, the experts from all over the world collected together and produced what we have just called the International Classification of Diseases, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. मौजूदा दौर में, मौजूदा सदी में यही हमारी कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव डेफिनेशन है और यही हमारा कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव व्यू है अबाउट मेंटल डिजीजेस. Take a look at what we have covered so far, and we will continue with some new schools, different schools of psychology in the next lecture. Until then, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.